Okay, so today we're going to take a deep dive into a really interesting case. One that's been making headlines and raising a lot of questions about gun ownership and immigration status.
Absolutely.
We're talking about Carlos Serrano Restrepo, who was recently charged with being in possession of a firearm while being an undocumented immigrant.
Right, and what's really interesting here is he had been living in the U.S. for over 15 years.
Yeah, so that adds a whole other layer of complexity, right?
Oh, absolutely.
So, Serrano Restrepo, he apparently had purchased at least 22 firearms.
Wow.
And get this,
Ugh.
he claimed to be a U.S. citizen on those official forms.
Oh, wow.
You know, those forms you have to fill out when you buy a firearm.
Yeah.
So that brings up a big question. What are the legal consequences, when someone makes a false statement like that?
Well, I mean, you're talking about a federal offense right there.
Right.
Federal law is very clear.
Right.
You have to provide accurate information on those forms.
Yeah.
And if you knowingly give false information, well, you could be facing criminal charges. We're talking hefty fines, even prison time.
Wow.
It's a really serious issue and a key element in this case, for sure.
Yeah, no kidding. Okay, so if that wasn't enough, get this.
Okay.
When authorities searched his home, they found a huge amount of weapons.
Oh, wow.
Like, it's a crazy amount. We're talking something like 170 firearms,
Yeah.
tens of thousands of rounds of ammunition, and they even found smoke and marine markers.
What?
Yeah, it sounds like something out of an action movie.
Yeah, that's wild.
So I got to ask, what are those things? What are smoke and marine markers even used for? And does that make things even more complicated legally?
So smoke and marine markers, they're mainly used for signaling. Like if you're in distress at sea or for
Right.
military purposes. Now, just owning them isn't illegal on its own.
Right.
But when you find them with, this enormous arsenal, it definitely raises some eyebrows.
Yeah.
It makes you question, is there a potential danger here? Or at least why would someone need all of this stuff?
Right, exactly. It really makes you wonder what was going through his mind. Now, his defense team, they argued that he had the right to own these firearms under the Second Amendment.
Yeah.
Particularly for self-defense. But how does that argument work when he wasn't a citizen? I mean, does the Second Amendment even apply to non-citizens?
Yeah, that's where things get really tricky. You see, the Second Amendment, it guarantees the right to bear arms, but
Right.
whether that applies to non-citizens, that's a whole other can of worms.
Okay.
It's a question that's been debated for ages. I mean, there's no easy answer.
Right.
And this case could actually set a major precedent one way or the other.
Wow. So this could have big implications.
Yeah.
And what's interesting is the judge in the case, he decided to deny Serrano Restrepo's request to dismiss the charges.
Interesting.
And his reasoning was pretty fascinating. He said that disarming immigrants who haven't sworn allegiance to the U.S. is actually consistent with our country's history and tradition of regulating firearms. So I'm curious, what does swearing allegiance actually involve? And how does that play into all of this?
Well, swearing allegiance is a really big deal when it comes to becoming a U.S. citizen.
Right.
You're basically making a promise to uphold the Constitution
Right.
and the laws of the United States.
Got it.
And I think the judge's focus on this idea of swearing allegiance,
Yeah.
it shows that in his view, becoming a full citizen, with all the rights and responsibilities that come with it,
Yeah.
but that's kind of a prerequisite for enjoying those Second Amendment protections.
Right. So it's not just about living here. It's about taking that extra step to become a citizen. And the judge was very clear about the difference between just living in the U.S. or even seeking asylum and going through the full process of naturalization to become a citizen.
Exactly.
So I think it's important for our listeners to understand the difference between those paths. How do they impact someone's legal rights when it comes to owning a gun?
Sure. So when someone is seeking asylum, they're fleeing persecution in their home country,
Right.
and they're granted temporary protection here in the U.S.
Huh.
But naturalization, on the other hand, is a much bigger commitment.
Like-
It's a multi-step process. You have to prove you're of good moral character. You have to pass tests on English and civics.
Right.
And a really crucial part of that is taking that oath of allegiance. It's like saying, I choose to be an American. I'm all in.
It's a choice. You're right. So this case, it seems to be drawing a pretty clear line between the rights of citizens and non-citizens when it comes to firearms. And I'm wondering, what kind of impact do you think this ruling could have on other immigrants living here, especially those who aren't citizens yet?
Well, I think it's hard to say for sure. But this could really change things. You
Yeah.
know, it might encourage lawmakers to make gun control laws even stricter, specifically for people who aren't citizens.
Wow.
And that brings up a lot of concerns about fairness and equal treatment under the law.
Absolutely.
So we'll have to see how this all unfolds in the courts and what kind of effects it has on legislation in the future.
Yeah. This is a really complex situation with a lot of moving parts. So before we wrap up, what are some key takeaways from this case? And what are some things you think our listeners should think about as they learn more about this issue?
Well, I think the main thing to remember is that this goes way beyond one guy and his guns. It makes us really think about what it means to be American, who gets to enjoy all the rights that the Constitution guarantees, and how do we balance individual freedoms with keeping the country safe?
Right. Big questions.
Exactly. There are no easy answers here. I encourage your listeners to do their own research, look at things from different angles,
Yeah.
and come to their own conclusions about this really complex and important issue.
It's definitely a case to keep an eye on, and we will be right here covering it every step of the way. So make sure you join us next time for another deep dive.
I'll be here.
Thanks for listening.
See ya.